The wind curled through the Wyoming pines like a whisper, sharp with the scent of snow not far behind. Dusk had dropped early, painting the treetops with cold shadow as Malachi Stone stepped out of the timberline. His boots left
Don't
deep
you worry
prints
now,
in the
little one.
frost-hardened
I'm
dirt,
right here.
and the breath from his
Everything's
horse
gonna be all
steamed
right,
like
you'll
ghost
see.
smoke in the chill air. He stopped 30 paces from the cabin. It was smaller than he'd imagined, tucked quiet beneath the slope like it was hiding. A curl of smoke wound from the chimney, steady, slow. Someone was home. His fingers brushed the worn leather grip of the Colt at his hip out of habit, not because he wanted trouble, but because trouble had followed him like a hungry coyote these past 12 years. He'd seen too many places burn behind him not to be cautious. He took 2 steps toward the porch. Then the door creaked open, and there she was, a little girl, maybe 10, face freckled, cheeks smudged with flour. A wooden spoon dangled from one small hand, and her dress, a pale blue now streaked with dirt, looked like it had been mended more times than it hadn't. Her dark hair was braided too neatly for a child who lived wild. She looked up at him with steady, almost adult eyes and said plainly, "I don't talk much, but I can cook." Malachi blinked. Of all the things he'd expected, a rifle barrel maybe, or silence, this was not it. He removed his hat slowly as if entering a church. "Evening," he said, voice low and rough from wind and years. "Didn't mean to scare you. Was just hoping for shelter. I can pay if need be." The girl tilted her head, studying him. Not scared, just quiet. After a beat, she stepped aside and said, "You hungry?" "I could eat." "Stew's on." "Come in." He stepped through the door like a man entering a memory. The heat hit him first dry and real. Then the smell. Rabbit, he thought, and something from a root cellar. Herbs, maybe. It stirred something in him that had been asleep a long time. The cabin was small but clean. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and the table bore 2 places, wooden bowls, one already filled. She moved back to the stove, spoon in hand, like she'd done it 1,000 times. No wasted motion. Malachi cleared his throat. "You live here, alone?" "Since spring." She didn't look up. "Fever took Mama first, then Papa. Buried him behind the barn." He went still. "I'm sorry," she shrugged. "Don't be." "I remember what they taught me. Mama taught me stew. Papa taught me how to shoot." He glanced toward the corner of the cabin. Sure enough, a rusted Winchester rested against the wall, beside a pair of boots far too big for her. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing how to survive. "What's your name, miss?" "Willer." "Willer Crawford. Malachi Stone." "You look like a stone." He gave a quiet huff, the closest thing to a laugh he'd managed in months. Willer ladled stew into the second bowl and slid it across the table toward him. It was hot and hearty, with a wild edge to it. He took a bite and his eyes closed briefly. "This is damn fine cooking," he muttered, then corrected, "Pardon my tongue." She didn't flinch. "Mama always said food was love made edible." He nodded slowly. "Your mama sounds like a wise woman." She was. The girl sat across from him and began to eat in silence. She didn't fill the space with talk, didn't fidget. Just ate, watching him every now and again like a stray dog sizing up a man for kindness. He respected that. They finished the meal quietly. Willer rinsed the bowls, wiped them dry with a homespun cloth, and then turned toward the hearth. "You can sleep by the fire." "I'll take the loft." Malachi turned to see a ladder built into the wall and a small sleeping nook above, tucked into the rafters like a bird's nest. "I appreciate your hospitality, Willer." She paused at the first rung of the ladder. "Mama said it was wrong to turn away a traveler. Said the Lord sent angels in dirty coats. Sometimes he looked down at his own coat, frayed, stained with years of trail dust and regret. I'm no angel. Still hungry, weren't you? He didn't answer. As she climbed into the loft, Malachi spread his bedroll on the floor near the fire. The warmth of the hearth seeped through his bones. He watched the flames flicker and listened to the wind dance outside the cabin walls. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. He'd planned to find an empty homestead, maybe borrow shelter, leave at first light. But fate had drawn him to a girl with 2 old eyes and a pot of rabbit stew. And for the first time in too long, he wasn't planning his next escape. He pulled his duster tighter around him and glanced toward the loft. Her breathing had already settled into a slow rhythm. Steady, unbothered. She'd taken him in without flinching, without asking why he rode alone, or why his name sounded familiar. That kind of trust didn't come cheap out here, and it sure as hell didn't come from being lucky. He laid back, staring at the rafters. Outside, the wind howled like it knew who he was. Inside, a child had offered him warmth without question. It had been a long time since someone did that. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 12 years, Malachi Stone didn't dream of blood or fire or running. He dreamed of a little girl in a blue dress saying, "I don't talk much, but I can cook." And when dawn came, it wasn't just the fire that warmed him. It was the sound of her voice calling softly from the stove. "Coffee's on." But before he could rise, a shadow passed across the window. Slow, deliberate. A bootstep on frost, and Malachi's hand went to the Colt by his side, because no good thing in his life had ever come without a reckoning, and this cabin, this girl, might just be the first good thing he'd found in too long to lose. He stood, slow, quiet, and said in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, "Willer, stay up there. Don't come down." Then he moved toward the door, toward the sound of trouble. By the time morning broke, the snow line on the far ridge had crept 2 notches lower. The wind had died down, but the sky stayed the color of hammered pewter. Malachi stood out front, shoulders hunched beneath his worn duster, studying the cabin roof with squinted eyes. Some of the shingles near the stovepipe were lifting. If another storm rolled in, the fire might not stay lit, and the loft up top where Willer slept would take the worst of the cold. He reached for the axe leaning by the chopping block and tested its weight in his hand. Good balance, handle still strong. A few logs needed splitting anyway. He got to work. Inside, Willer moved about with quiet purpose. She worked the stove with the same care as a grown woman twice her age, measuring out coffee grounds with a tiny wooden scoop carved into a flower shape. The smell of heat and brewing beans reached Malachi halfway through the second log. By the time he'd stacked the fresh-cut wood under the eaves, the front door creaked open. "You planning to patch that roof?" Willer asked, holding 2 tin mugs like she'd always intended one for him. "Planning to, yes," Malachi replied, taking the offered cup. "If you don't mind me clambering up there," she nodded. "Got extra shingles in the shed. Nails too, I think. Hammer's bent, but it'll do. You always this prepared?" Willer shrugged. "I've had time." Malachi took a sip. The coffee was real, bitter and scalding, just the way he liked it. He gave her a glance. "You know how rare this is out here?" "You mean coffee or a kid living alone?" His mouth tugged at the corner. "Both." They spent the next hour in wordless cooperation. She handed up shingles one by one as he moved across the roof, his boots crunching softly on frost-covered wood. It wasn't the first time he'd repaired a homestead roof, but it was the first time someone stood below looking up at him like he belonged there. When he was done, he climbed down slow, knees creaking more than they used to. Willer had already disappeared behind the cabin. He followed without thinking. What he found hit harder than a mule's kick. 2 wooden crosses, simple but carefully made. One stood slightly taller, the other smaller, and set closer to the tree line. Wildflowers, long since dried, had been arranged neatly beneath them. A child's work, done with reverence. He didn't speak, but she answered anyway. Fever took Mama in April. Papa held on till May. Buried him the day the river thawed. Malachi stood beside her, hat in hand. You did this? Papa showed me how. Her voice was steady, but the breath beneath it trembled just once. Said if I could plant a bean straight, I could bury a body proper. Mama always said flowers belonged on graves, even if they're dead too. He nodded once, eyes scanning the ridge where the wind curled through the pines like it had come to mourn. You stayed here, he said quietly. You didn't run. There wasn't anywhere to go. You're 10. I'm still here. That was all. They stood like that for a long time, silent side by side, while the breeze rustled what was left of autumn in the brush. Later, over breakfast, she sliced 2 pieces of bread she'd baked herself. Dense, dry, and chewy, but nourishing. He smothered his with a dab of salt and a curl of butter that must have been hoarded with care. You're not from these parts, she said after a while. Malachi took a slow drink. No, rode in from the Utah side. Been drifting. You got people. Had. A sister, long time ago. Ohio. Haven't written in years. Willer tore her bread piece by piece. Mama used to say a person who stops writing home is either hiding or ashamed. He stared at the fire, his jaw working slow. Might be both. She didn't press, just refilled his mug and went about wiping the tin plates. When he offered to fix the chicken coop next, she didn't answer right away. Then finally, Fox got one last week. I'll help string more wire. They worked like that quietly, steadily, with few words but much trust. It was only after mid-afternoon that he noticed the string of wire wrapped tight, strong knots every few feet, and how her small fingers worked it as fast as any ranch hand. You've done this before. Learned quick. He watched her for a long moment. You remind me of someone. Someone good? Someone brave. She looked up then, eyes meeting his, steady and searching. You look like someone who's been blamed for things that weren't your fault. He froze. The words settled between them like dust soft but heavy. She didn't ask for confirmation. Didn't need it. She just knew. He set the wire down. I'll make sure no fox comes again. You're staying. Malachi didn't answer. Not out loud, but he stayed. As twilight deepened, a hush fell over the woods, the kind of hush that only comes when 2 people, both wounded and weary, share warmth and don't feel the need to name it. That night, after the fire had burned low, Malachi stood at the threshold of the cabin, the stars bleeding silver above the tree line. The cold bit his face. He didn't mind. He'd been alone a long time, long enough to forget what it meant to be wanted. Inside, Willer was already asleep. Her doll lay beside her, tucked under a quilt stitched in uneven squares. One of the seams had frayed again. He'd mend it tomorrow. He turned to go back in. Then a sound cracked through the trees, a single horse's hoof on stone. Not an animal moving wild. A rider. Malachi slipped his knife from his belt. Not panicked, not afraid, but ready. Because there was no such thing as peace without a cost. And if someone had come looking for Malachi Stone, it meant the past wasn't quite ready to leave them alone. Not yet. The morning broke quiet, sun slipping through the frost-glazed window panes like gold through lace. Malachi sat at the table sipping coffee, elbows resting on the smoothed wood as his eyes followed Willer. She moved with purpose, tying her braid tight, her hands already dusted in flour. Her sleeves were rolled, her small face pinched in thought as she studied the pot on the stove. It was a rhythm, unspoken, almost sacred. You always up this early? Malachi asked. She nodded, not looking at him. Mama said the world's clearest when it's cold and still. Malachi couldn't argue that. He'd learned a similar lesson on battlefields and ridgelines, where silence meant survival and small sounds told whole stories. He took another sip, letting the warmth steady him. Willer turned and placed a thick slice of bread on his plate, then reached for a faded blue journal from the corner shelf. She held it like it was something holy. "Mama wrote this, said it was for me, for later, so I wouldn't forget how to make the good things. Not just food, but things that matter." She laid it gently on the table in front of him. The cover was cloth, worn to threads on the corners, and tied with a bit of lace that looked like it had once been part of a curtain or an apron. Malachi untied the knot, careful like it might fall apart if he breathed wrong. The first page was a recipe wild carrot stew with sage and salt pork. The next was how to clean and preserve rabbit skins. Another, tonics for cough, poultices for burns, even how to treat a tooth abscess using vinegar and ground cloves. But it wasn't just instructions. Each recipe carried little notes in a tidy, looping hand. "For when he comes home cold and quiet. Add honey if you have it. Sweeter days will return. Don't rush the fire. Good things need time." Malachi read slow, like walking through someone's soul. Willer slid into the seat across from him. "Mama said words can be medicine, same as herbs. She said writing them down was like planting seeds in case someone needed them later." He looked at her then, this strange little girl who held herself like a soldier and cooked like a mother, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "You've got more wisdom in this cabin than most churches," he finally said. Willer's face twitched with the beginning of a smile, but she hid it fast. "You're not the first to say that." She stood and reached into a drawer, pulling out something wrapped in an old kerchief. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a plain gold wedding band. The metal was scratched, but it caught the light just the same. This was Mama's. "I keep it close." She didn't say it like a child showing off treasure. She said it like someone protecting something too precious to ever lose. "I think it still smells like her," Willer added, almost to herself. Malachi didn't touch it. Some things weren't meant to pass through other hands. "What about your father?" he asked gently. Willer reached back and pulled an old skillet from the wall. Cast iron, blackened with age, but clean, well-oiled. "This was his," she said simply. "He said you could measure a man by how he cleaned his tools. Guns, knives, skillets." She hung it back up with care, like placing it on a mantle. "I keep it seasoned." Just like he showed me that afternoon, they walked the woods behind the cabin. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but it lingered in the air, curled at the edges of the sky. Malachi showed her how to find rabbit runs, narrow paths pressed low through the grass and underbrush. "You see this?" He pointed to a patch of dirt that looked like nothing at first glance. "Indentation," she said, crouching beside it. "They pass here often. Good eyes. Most men wouldn't spot that." He handed her a piece of wire. "Let's make a snare." She copied his fingers exactly. Malachi noticed the way she memorized everything, the twist of the loop, the anchor point. She tied it faster than expected, tugged it once to test tension, then looked up. "Like this?" "Exactly." "You sure you weren't a schoolmaster?" she asked, head cocked. He gave a dry chuckle. "I've been accused of worse." They set 3 snares before dusk, just off the trail behind the garden fence. She laid fresh carrots for bait. It was the kind of preparation most kids wouldn't know, but Willer moved with the precision of someone who'd spent too much time depending on herself. Back at the cabin, she boiled water while he stacked the evening wood. Later, over a stew of root vegetables and dried venison, she flipped through her mother's journal again, asking about plants Malachi had seen during his travels, bitter root in Montana, yarrow near the Black Hills. "You ever treat a snake bite?" she asked. "Twice. First time, it wasn't mine." "What happened?" He hesitated. He made it. Barely. And the second, Malachi's face darkened. She didn't. Willer didn't press, just handed him the last piece of cornbread and went to tend the fire. They didn't talk much more that night. They didn't have to. After Willer climbed to the loft, Malachi sat by the fire, the recipe book open on his knees. He traced the pages like scripture, drawn to the notes more than the ingredients. Tonight, you're safe. Tomorrow will come. Boil water even when there's no food. Warmth can be enough. He hadn't prayed in years, but holding that book he felt something stir in the hollow place inside him. When he rose to put out the lantern, he noticed a small pouch tucked beneath the journal. It wasn't there before. He opened it slowly. Inside were letters, folded, yellowed, addressed in the same neat handwriting. Mr. Malachi Stone, C.O. Laramie Post Office, or wherever the trail carries him. The return name hit like a hammer. Rebecca Stone, Ohio. He stared at the handwriting, his hands suddenly unsteady. You found them, Willer said softly from the loft above. I didn't know Mama had those, she added after a pause. Guess maybe she hoped one day you'd pass through. Malachi didn't respond. He just stared at the stack of unopened letters from the sister he'd left behind, from the life he'd buried. Outside, the wind had changed direction. He felt it in his bones. And for the first time in 12 years, Malachi Stone wondered if the trail wasn't leading him farther away, but finally back home. It was the kind of day where the air felt too still, like even the birds were waiting for something to happen. Malachi stood out back, checking the rabbit snares they'd set 2 days earlier. A good haul, 2 fat ones, clean caught. Willer would be proud. She'd taken to survival like a fish to water, asking questions he didn't expect from a 10-year-old. She was halfway through mending a quilt when he returned, her legs folded up under her on the porch, needle flashing in her hand. She squinted at the rabbits. "Two's good. I'll gut 'em after I finish this corner." "You're learning fast," he said, tossing the rabbits onto the wood block. "I didn't know how to set a snare till I was 16, and it took me near 3 weeks to catch anything that wasn't myself." Willer smirked. "I don't like being hungry." Malachi smiled, but his eyes scanned the tree line. That stillness again. Something off in the wind. He turned to chop firewood when the horse came into view. Rider slow, deliberate, broad in the shoulders. Black coat, dusty. A clean-cut man, maybe mid-30s, with a look that didn't match the friendly way he waved from the saddle. His boots were polished, gun belt too neat. Not a rancher, not a neighbor. "Morning," the stranger called out, reining his horse at the edge of the yard. "Didn't mean to spook you." Malachi set the axe down slow. Willer stood, straight-backed, watching. "Can I help you?" Malachi asked. The man tipped his hat. "Name's Garrett Vance. I'm looking for someone. Might have come through this way. Goes by Malachi Stone." Willer stepped down off the porch. Her face was unreadable. "That's not a name I know." Vance looked at her a long beat, then at Malachi. He studied him too long, like someone reading past a cover. "You sure?" he asked the girl. "Big fella. Worn coat, travel-worn boots, bit of a limp on the right side. Fought in the war, or so they say." Willer shrugged. "Don't know any war heroes. Just us here, me and my uncle." That hitched Malachi's breath, but he didn't flinch. "That's so?" Vance asked, turning his eyes back on Malachi. "Uncle." "Picked her up near Green River," Malachi said. "Parents passed. I've been keeping her fed, patched up the roof. Nothing more to it." Vance nodded slowly. "Well, if you do see anyone matching the name, best let the sheriff know. He's wanted for desertion and obstruction. Military doesn't forget that kind of thing." "Noted," Malachi said, voice level. Willer stepped forward, arms crossed. "You want water or something? We don't have coffee for strangers." Vance smiled at her, but his eyes stayed cold. "No, miss. You keep your coffee. I'll be on my way." He turned his horse, slow as he came, but he didn't ride off immediately. Instead, he paused halfway down the trail and looked back once. Willa raised her hand in a little wave. Only when he disappeared over the rise did she let out her breath. "You think he bought it?" she asked. Malachi exhaled hard. "He didn't come for coffee. He was measuring how many bullets we might have." "How many do we have?" "Not enough." She nodded, walking back up the porch like nothing had happened. Later that night, Malachi sat by the fire, oil lamp casting shadows up the log walls. The journal lay closed beside him, untouched. His hands rested on his knees, his jaw tight. Willa came down the ladder barefoot, wrapped in her blanket like a shawl. "You're quiet," she said. "So are you." "Yeah, but I'm usually quiet." He smiled faintly, then grew serious again. "You didn't have to lie for me today." "You didn't have to stay for me either." Malachi looked into the fire. The logs popped. Smoke whispered up the flue. "I've seen that man before," he said. "Years ago, Fort Keaton. He ran supply lines. Never liked how he looked at people. Always calculated like they were worth something on paper." "Is he military?" "Used to be. Now he works with bounty men. Carries warrants from D.C. to Montana. Not official, but dangerous." Willa sat down beside him, pulling the blanket tighter. "Is that your real name?" she asked. He hesitated, just long enough for her to notice. "Yes," he said. "And what did you really do?" Malachi's voice was flat. "I was part of a regiment assigned to sweep Cherokee land. Found a village small, no fighters, just families. We were supposed to clear it, burn it. I refused." He swallowed hard, eyes still on the flame. "I got them out, women, children, hid them in the canyon before the rest of the company came through. They said I'd deserted, that I'd helped the enemy. Court-martialed me in absentia. I never went back." Silence settled like snow. Willa leaned her head on his shoulder. "You didn't do wrong," she whispered. He didn't answer, but he closed his eyes just for a moment. In the woods beyond the window, an owl hooted once, low and long. And farther beyond that out, where the trail bent toward town, something metallic glinted briefly in the moonlight. A piece of paper nailed to the post at the fork. A wanted poster. Tomorrow it would blow loose and ride the wind down toward the cabin. But tonight, it waited, just like Garrett Vance. The snow came in the night. Light at first, just a dusting on the cedar branches and rooftops. But by morning it had laid itself thick and quiet across the meadow like a wool blanket, softening every edge. The world had gone still again, the kind of stillness that made your breath feel louder than it ought to be. Malachi shoveled the path to the woodpile while Willa shaped a loaf of bread in the warmth of the cabin. The fire crackled low, the scent of yeast and smoke mingling like they belonged together. It was the kind of day made for staying close. But Malachi's restlessness itched just beneath the surface. There was something he couldn't shake, a whisper from the past like a draft beneath the door. He returned inside and sat beside the fire, watching Willa fold the bread dough into the cast-iron pan her father had left behind. "How long does it take?" he asked. "Depends on the weather," she answered, covering the dough with a thin cloth. "Colder days make it rise slower." He nodded, thinking. "Like trust." Willa tilted her head. "Trust's the same way," he said. "Takes longer when things are cold." She gave him a half-smile, quiet and understanding beyond her years. "But it still rises, right?" "Eventually." He didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he rose and walked to the old chest in the corner, the one he hadn't touched since finding the journal. Something had nagged at him since then. A hunch. He lifted the lid and began to search carefully through the layers. Linens, sewing scraps, a few yellowing photographs. And then he found it. Tucked between two squares of lace was a bundle of letters, wrapped in red thread that had faded to rust. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, slanted right, ink now barely holding its shape. Rebecca Stone, his sister. Malachi sat back on his heels, heart thudding louder than the ticking clock on the shelf. He pulled the thread loose with fingers that trembled more than they should have. He read the first letter. Dear Malachi, it's been nearly 2 years since I last heard from you. I don't know where the army sent you or what you've done, but I believe you're still out there. You're my brother, and I remember the boy who carried me across the creek when I broke my ankle, who gave up his Sunday wages so I could buy a new dress for church. I believe you're still him. Please come home, or at least let me know you're alive. There were more, some hopeful, some angry. One simply said, I named my boy after you. He closed the last one and let it sit in his lap. Willer had gone quiet. She hadn't asked, just watched from the hearth. I thought she'd given up on me, he said after a while. I thought maybe I didn't deserve to be remembered. People don't stop caring, Willer said gently. They just don't always know how to hold on when the rope's frayed. Malachi looked at her. She wrote these for years, and they ended up here. She and Mama were friends, Willer explained, traded letters sometimes through town folk. When your name came up, Mama said it was best to keep them safe in case you ever wandered this way. Looks like she knew what she was doing. The fire cracked behind them. The bread had started to rise, just barely puffing under the cloth. Willer reached over and lifted the old wedding ring from the shelf, turning it once in her fingers. You said yesterday there are bridges you can't go back to. I did. She turned the ring again. Maybe you don't have to. Maybe you build a new one on the other side that stuck with him. Later that day, Malachi took the letters out again. This time he didn't stop at reading. He found a fresh page in the back of Willer's mother's journal, tore it carefully, and dipped a pen in ink. He wrote slow, each word deliberate, each line drawn like a scar healing over. Dear Rebecca, I'm sorry it took me this long. He finished the letter just as the smell of baked bread filled the cabin. Golden, warm, and whole. Willer brought it to him, proud. It turned out good. He broke it in half. The inside steamed. Sometimes it's not the flour or the fire, he said. Sometimes it's the waiting. You waited 12 years, she said. I did. But you didn't go bitter. He smiled at that, just a little. Maybe I just didn't finish baking yet. Outside, the snow had begun to melt at the edges where the sun kissed it. Tiny purple flowers, brave and stubborn, were pushing up through the white near the old fence line. Malachi walked out onto the porch with his coat slung over one shoulder. He looked toward the trail, toward town, toward the old life he'd never returned to, and then back at the cabin, at the bread, at the fire, at the girl who had reminded him what it meant to be steady. Behind him, Willer watched with quiet knowing. Then she said, You gonna mail that? I think I am. You'll need to go into town. I know. I'll pack food. And a knife. Don't forget the biscuits. She smiled. But as he stepped off the porch, something caught his eye in the snow near the barn. A mark, hoofprint, too deep, too fresh. And it wasn't his horse. He knelt slowly, brushing the snow aside, found a second print, then a third, all facing the cabin. He stood and turned toward Willer, already moving fast. Lock the door, he said. Don't open it unless it's me. She blinked. What's wrong? Malachi reached for his rifle. Garrett Vance isn't done looking. The wind had a new sound, not the whine of fall gusts sweeping through pines, but a howl low and steady like something wild had been loosed from the mountain. Malachi stood on the porch, his coat flapping behind him, snow curling at the edges of the roof. The first storm of winter had come in fast and heavy. It wasn't supposed to arrive this soon. Inside, the cabin was warm, the hearth full and the shutters bolted. But even stone walls could only hold so much against a storm like this. Willer hadn't come down from the loft all morning. At first, he thought maybe she'd slept in. But by mid-morning, when the kettle whistled and she hadn't stirred, Malachi climbed the ladder to check. She lay curled in the quilt, cheeks flushed too red, breathing shallow. He touched her forehead. Burned hot. "Willer," he said, crouching beside her. "You awake?" She stirred, mumbling something he couldn't catch. "Come on, girl. Look at me." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "You need water," he said, lifting her gently. "Let's get you warm. Real warm." She didn't fight him, which scared him more than anything. Down by the hearth, he sat her in the big chair wrapped in blankets, while he stoked the fire higher. Her head lolled against his arm. He found her mother's journal, flipped to the section on fevers and illness. Willow bark, crushed mint, hot broth, wet cloths for the neck. He moved like a man on a mission, built steam from the kettle, ground herbs, stirred broth. Everything with hands far too large for such delicate work, but steady, careful. She moaned once, tried to push the cup away. "Drink it," he said softly. "This one's from your mama." She wrote it down for days just like this. Her lips moved, slow and cracked. "Don't make promises you can't keep." He froze. It wasn't a plea. It was a truth. Something buried deep, rising like smoke from a dying fire. "I won't," he said. "Not this time." The hours passed in a haze of boiling water and soaked cloths. She coughed hard, twisting in the blankets. He wiped her face, whispered old cavalry hymns beneath his breath, the kind meant to keep ghosts away. At some point in the night, her hand found his and didn't let go. He sat by the fire, head bowed, that small hand in his palm like an anchor. "I know you're not mine," he said, voice low, "but I'd trade every trail I ever rode to make sure you make it through this." He didn't know if she heard, but he kept talking anyway. "You got grit, Willer. More than half the men I ever rode with. You've got your mama's mind and your papa's hands, and if there's a God left in this sky, you'll have more than just memories to live on." She didn't answer, but her breathing steadied. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was white and still. Frost clung to every pine needle like lace. Willer's fever had broken. She stirred around dawn, blinking against the firelight. "Did I say anything dumb?" she asked, voice rough. Malachi let out a breath that sounded like it came from the bottom of a well. "Not dumber than usual," she smiled weakly. "Good." He helped her sip water, spooned her some thin broth. She didn't finish it all, but she didn't argue either. Then, in a small voice, "You stayed." "I did. I had a dream you were gone. Not planning to go anywhere." "Promise?" He paused, then took her hand again. "This one I'll keep." They sat like that a long while, no words between them. Just fire and breath, and the sound of wind curling low through the chimney. Later that morning, she asked for her mother's journal. He fetched it, placed it in her lap, and noticed a dried flower tucked between the pages. Pale purple, pressed and perfect. Willer looked at it and smiled. Mama called them snow lilies. Said they only bloom after a storm. He looked out the window. The world was still wrapped in white, but here in the warmth of the cabin, there was something new in the air, not just relief. Hope. But when he stepped out to check the snares, he found more tracks. 2 sets, boot prints, fresh. No horse nearby. Someone was close, and they weren't just passing through. Malachi spotted them long before they reached the cabin. 3 men on horseback, moving slow through the fresh snow, following the trail up from the valley. The way they rode told him everything. One was relaxed but alert, one too stiff in the saddle like a lawman trying to look mean, and the third rode like a wolf on a scent. Garrett Vance. He stepped back from the tree line and made his way to the cabin, boots crunching through the drift. "They're coming," he said, brushing snow off his shoulders. Willer was sitting up by the hearth, wrapped in her mama's quilt, paler than usual but clear-eyed. She set down the mug of broth. "Is it him?" Malachi nodded. She didn't flinch. "You gonna run?" "No." He checked the Winchester leaning by the door, loaded, clean, but his hand didn't rest on it. When the knock came, it was deliberate. 3 raps, not rushed, not threatening, just patient. Malachi opened the door. Standing there, coat dusted with snow, was Tom Morrison, sergeant retired. Beard silver now, but eyes still sharp like they used to be back when Malachi called him sir. "Mornin', Mal." Behind him stood Garrett Vance, arms folded, smug. And next to Vance, a man in a Tin Star deputy by the look of his coat, from some town downriver. Unknown, and therefore dangerous. "Tom," Malachi said. "Mind if we step inside?" Morrison asked. Malachi stepped back. "Only if you tell me why you brought wolves to my door." Morrison raised a brow but walked in without answering. Garrett Vance followed, eyes scanning the cabin like a man picking out where to hang a noose. The deputy stayed near the door, hands loose by his belt. Willer sat up straighter. Didn't speak, didn't blink. "Nice place," Vance said. "Cozy. Almost makes you forget there's a war criminal in the room." "You here to talk or accuse?" Malachi asked. Vance smiled. "Both." Morrison sat down at the table, pulled off his gloves, and reached into his coat. From an inside pocket, he drew out a folded leather packet, and from that, a stack of weathered papers tied with string. "I came to tell you the Army's changing its story," he said. Malachi's shoulders tensed. "Too late for that." "Maybe," Morrison said, "but not for this." He untied the bundle and laid the pages out like cards in a bad hand. Official stamps, signatures, orders, testimonies. Willer leaned forward. Her eyes flicked over each heading, fast. One read, "Testimony of Lieutenant Richard Bennett, Events at Cherokee Hollow." Another, "Confidential Addendum, Civilian Casualty Avoidance." During disputed march orders, Morrison tapped the last one. "This one says you refused to obey an order that was later deemed unlawful. They just never made it public." Politics. Army didn't want to admit they almost wiped out a peaceful settlement for nothing. Vance stepped forward. "That's not official Army word. Those are drafts, internal memos, not exoneration." "They're enough to start a case," Morrison shot back, "and enough to stop you from dragging him out of here in cuffs." The deputy shifted, uncertain now. Malachi crossed his arms. "Why now?" Morrison looked at him, softer. "Because your sister wrote me. Sent me a copy of that first letter you mailed her last week. Said if there was still a good man buried under the uniform, now was the time to prove it." Willer glanced at Malachi. He didn't move. "And what changed your mind?" he asked. Morrison sighed. "I saw what they tried to do to you, what they made you out to be, and I remembered the man who carried a Lakota baby 5 miles through gunfire to get her to safety." Vance scoffed. "You playing hero now, Tom? This man's got a price on his head." "I know," Morrison said. "That's why I told you I'd help bring him in. That's what got me close." He stood, pulling his coat open. On the inside was a folded badge, Federal Marshal, Temporary Commission. "I used you, Vance, because I knew if I didn't come along you'd come up here guns blazing." Vance's face darkened. "You son of a..." Morrison drew his revolver and leveled it at Vance with the calm of a man who's drawn it too many times to miss. "You're not here on official order. You're here for bounty money. Private contractor, not sworn law. That makes this trespassing." The deputy took a slow step back. "I'm not getting involved in a jurisdiction mess," he muttered. Malachi looked at Morrison. "So now what?" "We get you to town." Quietly, "I file this paperwork. You get a fair hearing, and Vance. Let the judge deal with him." Willer stood up. "I'm going too." "No," Malachi said. "Yes," she said. "This started with both of us." "It ends that way," Vance's jaw clenched. "This isn't over." "No," Morrison said, "but it will be soon." Outside, the snow had started to fall again, thin flakes drifting sideways. Like time itself was stalling, waiting to see what would happen next. Malachi looked around the cabin one last time. The kettle, the stove, the corner where she kept her journal, the porch swing creaking in the wind. He turned back to Morrison. "When?" Morrison holstered his weapon. "Now. We're out of time. Harrison won't let this end quietly. They came at dawn, like cowards usually do. 4 riders from the ridge, 2 more circling from the creek bed. Not lawmen. These were hired guns, faces covered, rifles ready, spurs rattling like a warning bell. Snow still clung to their coats, but the way they moved said they weren't slowed by weather. Willer saw them first, eyes narrowing as she peeked through the cabin window. "They're not just passing through," she said. Malachi didn't need to look. He was already moving, slipping the rifle from the wall and checking the chamber. Morrison cursed under his breath and pulled his coat on. "Harrison's moving fast." "Doesn't want you making it to town," Malachi looked at him. "You said he wouldn't let it end quiet." "You were right. I always hated being right about men like Harrison." Outside, the sound of horses stamping snow turned to boots crunching gravel. Willer grabbed the ring from the shelf, her mother's wedding band, the last thing she had left of her family. "What are you doing?" Malachi asked. "Buying us time." Before he could stop her, she opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit her hard, but she stood tall in her muddy green dress, boots worn thin. No coat. Just the ring held high between her fingers, gleaming in the pale morning light. "5 minutes," she shouted. "That's all I ask." 5 minutes to say the truth. One of the riders laughed. "You think a child's bargain's worth more than a bullet?" She didn't flinch. "My mama wore this ring every day until the fever took her. She made every promise count. I'm not trading gold. I'm trading something real." 5 minutes. A long pause. Then a man dismounted. The leader, by the way. The others looked to him. Red scarf, peppered beard, Colt slung low on his hip. He stepped closer. "Talk fast, girl." Willer swallowed but kept her voice steady. "Malachi Stone isn't who they say he is. He saved lives during the war, civilians, children. He disobeyed an order because it was wrong, not because he was scared. And now the people who gave that order want him gone so no one hears the truth." Behind her, the cabin door opened. Malachi and Morrison stepped out, hands low but not empty. Morrison held a leather satchel. The gunman tensed, but the red scarf leader raised a hand. "No shots." Not yet. Morrison opened the satchel and pulled the papers free. Signed testimony, Army intelligence memos, field reports, all showing that Malachi Stone acted under conscience. The Court of Military Inquiry buried this to protect a congressman's reputation. That same congressman is paying you to silence him. The gunman shifted. One spat in the snow. And then, from behind the trees, came the sound of a wagon. Not hurried, not scared, steady. A covered rig rolled into view, flanked by 2 mounted deputies. Riding on the bench was a heavy-set man in a wool coat, gray hair curled under his hat, eyes sharp and weathered. Judge Worthington. He stepped down before the wagon stopped moving. "I got word there might be a hanging without a rope up this way," he said. "Thought I'd bring the law instead." The Red Scarf leader cursed under his breath. "Judge," Morrison said, holding out the papers. "The truth." Official and signed, Worthington flipped through the first pages, lips pursed. Then he looked at Malachi. "You served under Colonel Doolin?" "Yes, sir." "I knew Doolin. Good man, stubborn as a mule. But if what I'm reading is true, he ordered something that would have shamed every stripe he ever earned." Malachi didn't answer. Worthington turned to the gunmen. "Drop your contracts. This man stands under federal protection until the case is heard proper," the Red Scarf man growled. "You think Harrison'll let this slide?" The judge raised his brow. "He'll have to, unless he wants a public trial with witnesses and war records." The men looked at one another. One lowered his rifle, then another. One by one they turned their horses and rode off. Vance wasn't among them. Neither was Harrison. Morrison holstered his revolver. "For now, we're clear." Malachi turned to Willer, who still held the ring between her fingers. "You could have gotten killed." She smiled, eyes glinting. "I told the truth. That still counts for something, doesn't it?" He took the ring gently from her hand and pressed it back into her palm. "Keep it. You're the bravest one here." Worthington stepped closer. "I'll see to it you get your hearing, Stone. Real court, real judge. Until then, you've got my word as an officer of the law. Thank you." Willer leaned against Malachi's side. "Is it over?" He looked at the trail, already turning to slush under the rising sun. "No," he said, "but we just bought ourselves a fighting chance." And behind them, from the covered wagon, came a low cough. A woman's voice. "I believe I've waited long enough to see my brother." Rebecca. The town of Glenshade had never seen so many people gather in its small church hall. Judge Worthington stood near the pulpit, sleeves rolled and spectacles perched low on his nose. The stack of papers on the table beside him rustled in the breeze through the open window. It was crisp that morning, but the air felt alive like the first good breath after a long sickness. Malachi Stone sat near the front, hands folded, shoulders straight, jaw tight. Not from fear, but from years of not knowing how to sit still when all eyes were on him. Willer was beside him, feet barely touching the floor, back straight like she was sitting through Sunday school. Her braid hung over one shoulder, the ends tied in a bit of string she'd found behind the woodpile. She wore her best dress, washed and mended, and her mother's old shawl over her shoulders. Rebecca sat behind them, quiet and proud. She hadn't stopped looking at Malachi since she arrived, as if afraid he'd vanish again. "I've reviewed the documents," Worthington said, tapping the folder, "and I've spoken to both Marshal Morrison and military command back east. It is the judgment of this circuit court that Mr. Malachi Stone is hereby cleared of all charges related to desertion or misconduct during the Cherokee Hollow incident." There was a beat of silence, then a long exhale from Morrison at the back of the room. Malachi didn't smile. He only nodded once. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "a formal recommendation for commendation has been filed. The Department of War intends to award Mr. Stone with the Medal of Honor for his actions," the room murmured. Willer turned to look at Malachi. "What's a medal gonna do for you now?" He shrugged. "Might make folks listen when they wouldn't before." Worthington looked down at another paper. "One more matter, Miss Willer." She blinked, surprised. "Me?" He smiled gently. "You've been without legal guardianship since your parents passed. The town's been aware, but no one filed official notice. That changes today." Willer sat up straighter, the weight of her name suddenly heavier. "Do I need to go somewhere?" she asked, voice small. "Only if you want to," the judge replied. But there's another option. He turned to Malachi. You've given this girl food, shelter, protection, and a steady hand when she needed it most. You're not blood, but sometimes that's the least important part. If you'd be willing, I believe we can make this family official. Malachi looked at Willa. She didn't say a word, just nodded. He turned back to Worthington. I'd be proud to. Worthington signed the paper with a deliberate stroke. Then it's done. Applause rose gentle at first, then louder, a ripple of relief and approval that filled the little hall with warmth. Afterward, folks came up one by one, men Malachi had traded with, women who'd whispered about him over fences, kids who now stared at him like he was carved from legend. He shook hands, accepted pies, tipped his hat more times than he could count. When it quieted and only the fire crackled behind the stove, Willa took Malachi's hand. I got something, she said. She pulled a small cloth from her pocket and unfolded it slowly. Inside was her mother's wedding ring. Malachi stared at it, unsure. I want you to have it, she said. That ain't mine, Willa. It is now. She pressed it into his palm, then wrapped his fingers around it. So you'll always remember, she whispered. You're not alone anymore. He looked down at the tiny band of gold, dulled from years but still warm in his hand. He didn't speak, just pulled her into a quiet, solid hug. Through the open window, the sun broke through a thick cloud, spilling golden light across the floorboards. They walked home that afternoon with Rebecca beside them, and the trail ahead brighter than it had looked in years. But behind them, in the shadow of the alley, a figure watched from the saddle. Garrett Vance hadn't left town, and he wasn't done yet. The snow had long since melted, leaving behind rich earth and stubborn weeds. The cabin, once weather-beaten and tired, now stood proud with fresh pine siding, a new porch swing, and smoke rising steadily from the stone chimney. Wildflowers pressed through the soil along the fence line, bright, unruly bursts of yellow and blue, as if nature had finally decided this land was worth blooming for. Malachi Stone stood at the edge of the garden, shovel in hand, squinting up at the sky like he still didn't quite trust the weather to hold. But the air was warm, and the breeze smelled like growing things. Behind him, Willa was chasing a chicken across the yard, her laughter echoing through the holler. You got feathers in your braid again, he called without turning. That's not my fault, she said, breathless. Miss Clementine's got it in her head that she lives inside now. Maybe she thinks she earned it, he muttered, leaning on the shovel. The garden rows were straight and proud onions, turnips, a whole patch of mustard greens. The hen house, patched together from salvaged wood and elbow grease, had survived its first winter. The little shed Rebecca had helped design was now a working smokehouse. Everything was smaller than the life Malachi had once imagined, but somehow it fit him better. Inside, the cabin smelled like bread rising. Willa had mixed it that morning, carefully folding in the last of the dried herbs her mama had left in the recipe book. The sourdough starter had survived the cold months, tucked away in its crock like a sleeping heartbeat. She treated it like treasure. In a way, it was. At noon, Rebecca would arrive on horseback from town, bringing letters, sugar, and tales from the courthouse. Malachi was supposed to ride patrol again that evening, his new badge hung by the door on a nail carved smooth by his thumb. Deputy Stone, folks called him now. Not cowboy, not deserter, not ghost, just a man with a home and a shovel and a child who called him hers. He stepped inside to the smell of baking. Willa stood on tiptoe, peeking through the oven door, face warm from the fire. 10 more minutes, she said. Then you get the heel piece. He grunted. Long as I don't have to fight the rooster for it. She looked at him then, more serious than usual. You know what today is, he thought. 6 months. She nodded. Since you walked up to the cabin. Since I opened the door. He nodded once, remembering that muddy little girl with her mama's ring and a wooden spoon like a sword. "I didn't know how to talk to you then," she said. "Still don't, sometimes." "You do just fine," he replied. She stepped closer, pulled something from her apron pocket. It was a handkerchief, folded tight. Inside was a tiny sprig of dried violets. "For Mama's windowsill," she said. "She always said spring meant we made it." He took it gently, nodded, then reached up and set the dried flowers above the sill. Silence settled for a moment, soft as flannel. Then, from behind him, Willer whispered, almost too quiet to hear, "Papa." He froze, turned. She looked up at him, face open and unafraid. "I think, if it's all right with you, I'd like to call you that now." His throat tightened. The shovel handle still had soil under his nails. He'd fought wars, crossed deserts, built fences with his bare hands. But nothing had ever hit him like that single word from her lips. He knelt slowly until they were eye to eye. "You call me whatever you want, Willer. But if you say Papa again, I might not be able to stand up for a while." She smiled, and the cabin felt full like the walls had stretched just to hold the moment. The oven dinged. The bread was done. Later that evening, the three of them, Malachi, Willer, and Rebecca, sat on the porch. The sun dipped low, painting the hills in gold. They passed around fresh bread, still warm, butter melting into every bite. The hens clucked lazily, a fox called in the distance, and the trees whispered with the wind. "Next spring," Rebecca said, "I might stay longer." "Help plant a second field," Malachi nodded. "Could use the help." Willer leaned her head against his arm, full and happy. "There's something good here," she whispered, "something worth keeping." Malachi looked out at the land, at the cabin, at the girl who called him Papa. "It ain't much," he said softly, "but it's ours." And from that little porch in the hills, the world no longer felt cold. Not anymore. The end. But out here in the West, every end is just another beginning. If you felt something stir in your chest, if you rooted for the giant cowboy and the orphan girl, don't ride off just yet. There are more stories coming, more hearts to heal, more homes to build. Subscribe to Western Legacy and saddle up for the next ride.